Corrupt judge tries to steal elderly couple's storage unit. Courtroom gasps when he sees what's inside. The judge's gavel froze midair when the rusted lockbox tumbled open across the courtroom floor, spilling photographs that should have been buried with their secrets 40 years ago. And there, staring up from faded Polaroids scattered between the witness stand and the bench, was Judge Harold Whitmore's own face, decades younger, standing beside a man everyone in town believed had simply disappeared. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The silence that followed was the kind that makes ears ring. Eleanor Martinez, 73 years old, with hands gnarled from arthritis, stood trembling at the plaintiff's table, her fingers still gripping the edge of the box she'd been ordered to present as evidence. Her husband, Frank, 81, and moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd survived 3 heart attacks, reached for her elbow to steady her, though his own hands shook. "Your Honor," the bailiff began, his voice uncertain, eyes darting between the judge and the photographs now visible to everyone in the front rows. Whitmore's face had drained of color. The gavel completed its descent with a crack that made half the courtroom flinch, but the sound felt hollow, performative. His eyes, which moments before had held the cold certainty of a man accustomed to having his way, now betrayed something Eleanor recognized from her years as a hospice nurse, the look of someone watching their own life flash before them. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Whitmore announced, his voice strained but still carrying the weight of authority. He stood abruptly, his black robes swirling.
"Bailiff, secure that evidence. No one is to touch it." But it was too late. The photographs had already been seen. Eleanor watched as the young reporter from the Millbrook Gazette in the second row leaned forward, her phone angled downward. The journalist's mentor, Walt Emerson, a man who'd been covering the courthouse beat for 40 years, sat beside her with his arms crossed, his weathered face registering something between shock and vindication. The courtroom erupted into whispers the moment Whitmore's chamber's door clicked shut. "Did you see that? Isn't that the Hendricks case from the 80s? I thought that was ruled a suicide." Frank's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm. "We need to leave," he whispered. "Now, Ellie, before this gets worse." But Eleanor couldn't move. She stared at the photographs scattered across the floor, images she'd only glimpsed in the moment before the box had slipped from her arthritic grip. 40 years she and Frank had been paying for a storage unit in Frank's late brother's name, never knowing what was inside, never asking questions because sometimes not knowing was safer than knowing. The storage facility had sent the final notice 3 months ago. Pay the $4,800 in back fees or the unit would go to auction. They didn't have $4,800. They barely had enough for Frank's medications. Eleanor had been ready to let it go, to let whatever was in Unit 47 become someone else's problem. Then Judge Whitmore himself had appeared at their door. It had been a Thursday afternoon, unseasonably warm for October. Eleanor had been folding laundry when the doorbell rang. Frank, watching his game shows, had called out that he'd get it, but Eleanor had beaten him to it, drying her hands on a dish towel. The man on their porch had been imposing even without his robes, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of face that belonged on campaign posters. His smile had been warm, almost grandfatherly. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, I'm Harold Whitmore. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Eleanor had known who he was, of course. Everyone in Millbrook knew Judge Whitmore. His family had owned half the county for 3 generations. His father had been a judge before him. His son was being groomed for the state senate. "It's about a storage unit," Whitmore had continued, still smiling.
Unit 47 at Morrison Storage on Route 9. I understand it belonged to Francis Martinez, your brother? This last part directed at Frank, who had appeared behind Eleanor, suspicious and protective. My brother's been dead 30 years, Frank had said flatly. Yes, I'm aware. My condolences. The thing is, there's been a clerical error at the facility. The unit was supposed to be liquidated after your brother's passing, but somehow it remained in the system. Now there's a significant amount of back fees, and the facility is pursuing legal action to recover them. Eleanor had felt her stomach drop. How much? Nearly $5,000. Whitmore's expression had been sympathetic. I know that's a substantial amount, but I'm here to offer you a solution. I'm willing to purchase the contents of the unit sight unseen. Whatever's in there, I'll take it off your hands and settle the debt with the facility. You won't owe anything. It had seemed too good to be true. Frank had said as much. Why would you do that? Her husband had asked. What's in there that you want? Whitmore's smile hadn't wavered. To be honest, I don't know what's in there. I'm a collector of sorts. Antiques, memorabilia. Your brother worked at the textile mill in the 70s and 80s, didn't he? That mill produced some interesting items before it closed. I'm hoping there might be some vintage equipment, maybe some old tools or documents related to the mill's history. I'm working on a book about Millbrook's industrial heritage. The explanation had been smooth, rehearsed. Eleanor had recognized the cadence. She'd heard it in doctors who were hiding bad news, in funeral directors offering their most expensive caskets, in salesmen who knew exactly which pressure points to push. Well, think about it, Eleanor had said, starting to close the door. Of course. Whitmore had produced a business card, but the facility needs an answer by the end of the month. After that, they'll auction the contents, and you'll still be liable for the fees. My offer expires with the deadline. Please consider it carefully. He had left them with the card and a sense of unease that had settled over their small house like dust. That night, lying in bed, Frank had been the one to voice what they'd both been thinking. Tommy never worked at the mill, he'd said quietly. He was a mechanic, worked at Grayson's Auto Body his whole life. Eleanor had stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creak of the house settling. Why would a judge lie about something like that? Because he wants what's in that unit, and he doesn't want us to know what it is. The next morning, they'd driven to Morrison Storage. The facility manager, a tired-looking woman named Denise who smelled like menthol cigarettes, had pulled up the account on her ancient computer. Unit 47, yeah. Francis Martinez. Rented in 1983, paid through 1987, then payments just stopped. We usually auction these after a year of non-payment, but she'd squinted at the screen. There's a note here. Legal hold, pending investigation. But there's no case number, no date. This shouldn't still be in the system. Can we see inside? Eleanor had asked. Denise had shrugged. It's in your husband's brother's name. You got ID and proof of relation? They'd had both. Frank's driver's license, Tommy's death certificate from 1994, a couple of old photos showing them as children, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Unit 47 had been at the far end of the facility, in a section that looked older than the rest, where the corrugated metal had rusted orange and the numbers had faded to ghosts on the doors. Denise had cut the facility's lock with bolt cutters, the snap echoing across the empty lot. Haven't been open since '87, she'd muttered, wrestling with the rolling door. Might be stuck. When it finally gave way, the smell had hit them first. Old paper, mildew, something chemical and stale. The unit was small, maybe 5 by 10, and nearly empty. Just 3 items. A large plastic storage tub with a cracked lid, a military-style duffel bag, and the metal lockbox that was now spilling its secrets across the courtroom floor. Eleanor had been reaching for the lockbox when Denise's phone had rung. Morrison Storage, she'd answered. Then her expression had changed. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. But the family is here right now. They're—" A pause. "I see. Yes, sir. Right away." She'd ended the call and looked at them with something between embarrassment and fear. "I'm sorry. I've been instructed to secure this unit immediately. You need to leave." "Instructed by who?" Frank had demanded. "I can't say, but there's apparently an active legal claim on the contents. I shouldn't have let you in. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." They'd argued, but arguing with a minimum wage storage facility manager got them nowhere. Denise had locked the unit with a new padlock and refused to say anything more, just repeated that they'd be contacted by the proper legal authorities. Those authorities had turned out to Judge Whitmore's office. A letter had arrived the following week, formal and coldly polite, informing them that a claim had been filed against the contents of Unit 47 by an interested party with legal standing, and that the matter would be resolved in court. The interested party with legal standing, it turned out, was Judge Harold Whitmore himself. He'd filed the claim through a shell company buried in enough legal paperwork to make Eleanor's head spin. Their court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Sarah Voss, fresh out of law school, had explained it in simple terms. "He's arguing that your brother-in-law was storing property that actually belonged to someone else. He claims to be representing the estate of that original owner. If he can prove it, he gets the contents. If he can't, you do, but you'll still owe the storage fees." "That's insane," Frank had said. "He's a judge. How can he sue us and judge the case?" "He recused himself from presiding," Sarah had explained. "But he arranged for Judge Patricia Hendricks to hear it, and Hendricks—" she'd chosen her words carefully. "Let's just say she and Whitmore have been colleagues for a long time." The trial had been scheduled for November 15th. Sarah had filed motions to have the unit's contents examined by a neutral third party to get documentation of what was inside before the hearing. Every motion had been denied. Judge Hendricks had ruled that the contents would be revealed in court in front of both parties to ensure fairness. Eleanor had known it was rigged. They both had. But what could they do? The morning of the trial, Sarah had arrived at their house with dark circles under her eyes and a coffee cup that had already been refilled 3 times. "I need to prepare you," she'd said. "This isn't going to go well. Hendricks is going to rule in Whitmore's favor no matter what's in that unit. Our only chance is to make enough noise, create enough questions that it becomes politically difficult for her to just hand everything over to him." "How do we do that?" Eleanor had asked. Sarah had glanced at the reporter's notebook sticking out of her bag. "Walt Emerson owes me a favor. He's going to be there. If there's anything unusual in that unit, anything that doesn't add up, I need you to make sure people see it, make sure people ask questions." "You're asking us to cause a scene," Frank had said. "I'm asking you to fight for what's yours." The courtroom had been surprisingly full. Walt Emerson and his young protege in the second row, several other local reporters, some courthouse regulars who showed up to any trial that might be interesting. And in the back, partially obscured by the crowd, Eleanor had spotted a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that reminded her of winter. The woman had been staring at Judge Whitmore with an intensity that was almost physical. Judge Hendricks had opened the proceedings with brisk efficiency. Whitmore's attorney, a shark in a $1,000 suit named Gregory Burke, had presented his case. Francis Martinez had been in possession of property belonging to the late Robert Hendricks, no relation to the judge, supposedly. Property that had never been returned to the Hendricks estate. As the executor of that estate, Mr. Whitmore was entitled to reclaim it. And what property would that be? Sarah had asked during cross-examination. Documents, Burke had said smoothly. Photographic evidence and documentation related to business transactions conducted between Mr. Hendricks and the Millbrook textile mill in the early 1980s. Business transactions, Sarah had repeated. Could you be more specific? Industrial equipment sales. Mr. Hendricks was a supplier. It was all so vague, so carefully worded. Eleanor had watched Judge Hendricks nod along as if this made perfect sense.
Then it had been their turn. Sarah had called Eleanor to the stand, had her explain the timeline. Tommy's death in 1994, the storage unit they'd never known about, the fees they couldn't pay, Whitmore's sudden interest. "And you've never seen the contents of this unit?" Judge Hendricks had asked, her tone making it clear she'd already decided Eleanor was lying. "Not until today, Your Honor." The bailiff had brought in the items from Unit 47 on a wheeled cart. The plastic tub, the duffel bag, the lockbox. They'd looked pathetic and small in the formal setting of the courtroom, like artifacts from someone else's life. "Let's begin with the storage tub," Judge Hendricks had directed. The bailiff had pried off the lid. Inside, old clothes, a pair of work boots, some cassette tapes, a Polaroid camera, and a stack of magazines from the early 80s. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth fighting over. The duffel bag. More of the same. Mechanics' tools, some old rags stained with motor oil, a thermos, a lunchbox with a faded Dukes of Hazzard sticker. Gregory Burke had been smiling. Judge Hendricks had looked almost bored. And finally, the lockbox. It had been heavier than it looked. The bailiff had needed both hands to lift it from the cart. The lock had been rusted shut, and he'd had to use bolt cutters for the second time that day. Eleanor had been called to approach the bench, to be the one to open it. Her hands had been shaking as she'd worked the stiff hasp. The metal had been cold against her arthritic fingers. And then it had happened. The hasp had given way suddenly, and the box had slipped, just for a moment, and tipped forward, and the contents had spilled out across the polished courtroom floor. Photographs. Dozens of them. Polaroids and larger prints, some in color, some in black and white. And documents. Police reports, coroner's findings, newspaper clippings. Eleanor had bent to gather them, embarrassed and flustered. And that's when she'd seen the first image clearly. A young man, maybe 30, standing beside a car, smiling, handsome in the way men were in the early 80s, with feathered hair and a mustache. She'd recognized him immediately from the photos at the funeral she'd attended as a young bride, Frank's brother Tommy. But it was the man standing next to Tommy who had made her freeze. Young, tall, the same arrogant posture he'd carry into old age. Harold Whitmore. She'd reached for another photo. This one showed Whitmore shaking hands with an older man outside the textile mill. In the background, visible through a chain-link fence, were barrels marked with hazard symbols. Another photo, the same barrels being loaded into a truck. Tommy visible in the frame, watching. Another, a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local businessman dies in apparent suicide. No foul play suspected." The name, Robert Hendricks. Eleanor's hands had been full of evidence when she'd looked up and met Judge Whitmore's eyes across the courtroom. The color had already been draining from his face. He'd known what was in these photos. He'd known because he'd been looking for them for 40 years. Now, standing in the courtroom as it buzzed with whispered speculation, Eleanor felt Frank's hand on her back, steady and sure. "The recess won't last long," Sarah whispered, appearing at their side. "When Hendricks comes back, she's going to try to seal all of this as evidence, claim it's not relevant to the case. We need to—" "Everyone needs to see these," Eleanor interrupted. She bent down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and began gathering the photographs. Not to hide them, to display them. Sarah understood immediately. She knelt beside Eleanor, helping to organize the photos on the plaintiff's table where the gallery could see. Walt Emerson was already on his feet, his phone out, taking pictures. His young protege was typing furiously on her laptop. The bailiff moved toward them. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the evidence." "It's my evidence," Eleanor said firmly. "From my family's storage unit. I have every right to look at it." "Your Honor hasn't authorized." "Your Honor isn't here." It was a small act of defiance, but it felt enormous. Eleanor's heart hammered as she laid out photo after photo. A timeline began to emerge from the scattered images. Robert Hendricks had owned a chemical disposal company in the early 1980s. The textile mill had hired him to handle their waste, toxic dyes, heavy metals, industrial solvents. But proper disposal was expensive, much cheaper to simply dump the barrels in the old quarry outside town or bury them in the woods beyond the county line. The photos documented it all. Hendricks and Whitmore together at the mill. Whitmore, younger then, working as the mill's attorney, facilitating the contracts. Tommy Martinez, the mechanic who serviced Hendricks' trucks, who must have started asking questions or taking pictures, or maybe just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a police report in the box dated March 15, 1984. Robert Hendricks found dead in his garage, car running, apparent suicide. Case closed within 48 hours. Investigating officer, Lieutenant James Whitmore, Harold's father.
Oh my God.
Sarah breathed. She'd found a document near the bottom of the box, a letter in Tommy's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the storage unit was rented, addressed to whoever finds this. Sarah began reading aloud, her voice cutting through the courtroom murmur. If you're reading this, something's happened to me. I know what they did. I know about the dumping, about Hendricks, about Whitmore covering it up. I have proof. I tried to do the right thing, tried to report it, but nobody's listening. Whitmore's father is the police chief. His family owns half the judges in the county. I'm putting everything in storage because I don't trust it in my house. My brother Frank doesn't know anything about this. Keep him out of it. He's got Eleanor and the baby to think about. If I disappear, if something happens, make sure people see these photos. Make sure they know the truth. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt the weight of 40 years pressing down on her. Tommy had died in 1994, 10 years after he'd written that letter. Heart attack, the death certificate said. He'd been 43 years old. She looked at Frank. His face was wet with tears. He wasn't bothering to wipe away. He was trying to protect us, Frank said hoarsely. All this time. The door to Judge Hendricks' chambers opened, but it wasn't Hendricks who emerged. It was Harold Whitmore, and he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 15 minutes. His face was gray, his hands gripping the doorframe as if he needed the support. Behind him, Judge Hendricks appeared, her expression thunderous. This court is resuming session. Everyone will take their seats immediately. Bailiff, I want that evidence secured and… Patricia. Whitmore's voice was quiet, but it stopped her mid-sentence. He moved into the courtroom with the careful steps of someone walking toward the gallows. Harold, don't, Hendricks warned. We can contain this. We can contain it. Whitmore's laugh was bitter. He looked at Eleanor, at Frank, at the photographs spread across the table. It's been 40 years, Patricia. 40 years of waiting for this to surface, of wondering who else knew, of making sure every piece of evidence, every witness, every question got buried before it could reach anyone who mattered. The courtroom had gone so quiet, Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. You're not thinking clearly, Hendricks said, but there was fear in her voice now. You need to consult with your attorney. Robert Hendricks didn't kill himself, Whitmore said, addressing the room now. My father killed him. Made it look like suicide, because Hendricks was about to confess to the illegal dumping, was going to expose everyone involved, including me, including the mill owners who paid for my law school, including the judges and city council members who took bribes to look the other way. Gregory Burke was on his feet. Your Honor, my client is clearly not in a state to… Shut up, Greg. Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip. I'm not your client anymore. I'm a criminal who's been running from justice for 40 years. He turned to Eleanor and Frank. Your brother? Tommy. He didn't die of a heart attack, did he? That's what you've been thinking since you opened that box. Frank's voice was steel. What did you do to him? I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking, but I destroyed his life. After he started taking those pictures, asking questions, I made sure he couldn't work anywhere in the county, blacklisted him, spread rumors that he was unstable, a thief. He lost his job at the auto body shop, lost his friends, couldn't get work anywhere. The stress, the shame, it ate him alive. By the time his heart gave out, he'd been drinking himself to death for years. Eleanor felt rage building in her chest, hot and pure. You murdered him. Maybe not with your hands, but you're right. Whitmore's shoulders sagged. You're absolutely right. The woman Eleanor had noticed earlier in the back of the courtroom stood up. Her voice rang out clear and cold. My father didn't kill himself. All eyes turned to her. Judge Hendricks had gone white. My name is Catherine Hendricks. Robert Hendricks was my father. I was 12 years old when James Whitmore murdered him and called it suicide. I've been waiting 39 years for proof. She moved forward, holding out a worn folder. These are my father's real records, the ones he kept before they killed him. Documentation of every illegal dump site, every payoff, every name. I've been trying to get someone to listen for decades, but doors kept closing. Cases kept getting dismissed. Evidence kept disappearing. Now I know why. Sarah was staring at Catherine like she'd seen a ghost. You've been trying to get this investigated? You contacted my office 6 months ago. The environmental crimes complaint? That was thrown out before it reached a judge, Catherine finished. Insufficient evidence. I wonder who made that call. Judge Hendricks moved toward her gavel, but Walt Emerson's voice stopped her. Judge, I have 3 cameras recording this. Whatever you're thinking of doing, the whole county is going to see it. Hendricks froze. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, measuring loyalties against survival, weighing decades of corruption against the very public nature of this moment. Finally, she set down the gavel. I'm recusing myself from this case. Bailiff, contact the State Attorney General's office. This court is adjourned pending investigation. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Frank's hand found hers, and they held on to each other as reporters surged forward, as bailiffs tried to maintain order, as Harold Whitmore stood in the center of the chaos, looking like a man who'd finally stopped running. Sarah knelt beside Eleanor's chair. Are you okay? I don't know, Eleanor answered honestly. We just wanted to let it go. The storage unit, the fees, all of it. We just wanted to let it go. I know, but your brother-in-law didn't let it go. He made sure the truth survived. And now, because of you, it's finally coming out. Over the next 3 hours, the courthouse transformed into the center of a storm. State police arrived. The Attorney General sent investigators. Every photograph, every document from Unit 47 was cataloged and secured as evidence, real evidence this time, in a real investigation. Harold Whitmore was arrested at 4:47 p.m., let out in handcuffs while news cameras recorded every moment. Judge Patricia Hendricks resigned before she could be formally charged, though the investigation would eventually catch up with her too. The toxic dump sites were real. Over the next 6 months, environmental crews would find contamination at 7 locations around Millbrook County. Heavy metals in the groundwater, carcinogens in the soil. Cleanup would cost taxpayers millions. 3 former mill executives would be indicted. 2 former city council members would plead guilty to accepting bribes. And Catherine Hendricks would finally get to bury her father's memory with the truth. But that night, Eleanor and Frank sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd eaten breakfast that morning before the trial, and tried to process what had happened. We should call the kids, Frank said eventually. They're going to hear about this on the news. In a minute. Eleanor was holding one of the photographs, Not one of the incriminating ones, but a personal one from the bottom of the box. Tommy, in his 20s, sitting on the hood of a car, laughing at something off camera. He looked so young, so unburdened by the knowledge that would eventually crush him. He was a good man, she said quietly, better than he needed to be. He could have just looked away, kept his head down, kept his job. He was my brother, Frank's voice broke, and I never knew. All those years he was struggling, drinking, falling apart. I thought he'd just given up. I thought he was weak. You didn't know. I should have asked more questions, should have been there. Eleanor set down the photograph and took her husband's hands. He kept you out of it to protect you, to protect us, because that's what love looks like sometimes. Keeping the people you care about away from the danger, even if it means carrying it alone. They sat in silence for a while, holding hands across the kitchen table, mourning the brother they'd lost twice, once to death and once to the truth they'd never known. The phone rang around 8 p.m., Sarah Voss calling to check on them. I wanted you to know, the court ruled in your favor, obviously. The contents of Unit 47 belong to you, but the state is formally requesting them as evidence. They're willing to compensate you for the storage fees and provide certified copies of everything for your family records once the trial is over. Trial? Eleanor asked. Multiple trials, probably. This is going to take years to fully prosecute. But Whitmore's already talking about a plea deal. With his cooperation, they might be able to bring charges against some of the people who are still alive. And Tommy? Frank asked, taking the phone from Eleanor. What about justice for what they did to him? Sarah's sigh was heavy. I don't know, Frank. It's been so long. The people who actively destroyed his life, most of them are dead or can't be prosecuted. But the truth is out now. Everyone will know what he did, what he tried to stop. That has to count for something. After they hung up, Eleanor made tea while Frank sat at the table, the photograph of young Tommy still in front of him. I want to find his grave, Frank said suddenly. I want to bring these photos, show him we know, that it mattered. We'll go tomorrow, Eleanor promised. Tommy Martinez was buried in St. Catherine's Cemetery on the east side of town, in a section that had been added in the 90s. The stone was simple. His name, his dates, the word brother. Frank and Eleanor hadn't had much money for the funeral. They'd been raising 3 kids on Frank's machinist salary and Eleanor's nursing income. They'd done the best they could. The morning after the trial, they drove to the cemetery with a folder containing copies of the photographs and Tommy's letter. It was cold, the November wind cutting through their coats, but the sun was out, bright against the gray sky. Frank knelt by the headstone, his joints protesting, and placed the folder against the cold marble. Hey, Tommy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I didn't understand. But we know now. We know what you did, what you tried to do. Eleanor stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. She thought about all the times over the years she'd wondered about Tommy's drinking, his paranoia in those final years, the way he'd pushed everyone away. They'd thought he was broken. They'd thought he'd given up. He'd been terrified and alone. And still trying to do the right thing. The truth came out, Eleanor added softly. Because of you. People are going to be held accountable. The dump sites are being cleaned up. Your photographs, your evidence, it saved lives, Tommy. It might save more. A crow called from somewhere in the bare trees. The wind rattled through the dead leaves still clinging to the oak branches overhead. Frank stood slowly, wincing at the pain in his knees. I used to come here on his birthday, he said to Eleanor. Bring some flowers, say a few words. I'd talk about the weather, about the kids, stupid stuff. I never knew what to say to him. You say it now, Eleanor told him. Everything you wanted to say. So Frank did. He talked about the childhood they'd shared, about the treehouse Tommy had built that their father had made them tear down because it was too dangerous. About the time Tommy had taken the blame for the broken window so Frank wouldn't get grounded before the school dance. About 100 small kindnesses and brotherly competitions and shared secrets. "You were braver than me," Frank finished. "You always were. I'm proud to be your brother." They stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through their shoes, until finally Eleanor said they should go. They had an appointment with Catherine Hendricks that afternoon. She wanted to meet them, to thank them, to share what she remembered about her father. As they walked back to the car, Frank said, "What do you think happens now? To us, I mean, after all this?" Eleanor considered the question. They were still broke. They still owed medical bills. Frank's heart wasn't getting any stronger, and her arthritis wasn't getting any better. The trial and its aftermath had made them briefly famous, but fame didn't pay the bills. "I think we keep living," she said finally. "We tell our kids and grandkids about their Uncle Tommy. We make sure his story doesn't get forgotten once the news cameras go away." That's it. That's everything. The meeting with Catherine Hendricks took place at a quiet diner on the edge of town, far from the reporters still swarming the courthouse. Catherine was waiting in a back booth, 2 cups of coffee already on the table. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as they sat down. "Why wouldn't we?" Eleanor asked. "Because I've been chasing this for 40 years, and it's destroyed relationships, cost me jobs, made me seem crazy to people who didn't want to believe." Catherine smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I thought you might not want to be associated with that kind of obsession." Frank shook his head. "Your father was murdered. You wanted justice. There's nothing crazy about that." Catherine's eyes welled up. "Thank you. You have no idea how much it means to hear someone say that." They talked for 2 hours. Catherine shared stories about her father, a gentle man who'd loved fishing and old movies, who'd read her bedtime stories in funny voices, who'd been tormented by what he'd done, dumping those chemicals, poisoning the land. "He was going to confess," Catherine said. "He'd already talked to a lawyer, someone outside the county who couldn't be bought. He was going to testify about everything, the dumping, the bribes, all of it. And then one morning, I woke up, and he was dead." "And no one believed you," Eleanor said. "Why would they? I was a 12-year-old girl. The police said it was suicide. The newspaper said it was suicide. My own mother said I needed to accept it and move on. But I saw my father the night before he died. He was relieved. He was lighter than I'd seen him in years because he'd finally decided to tell the truth. That's not how suicides feel." She pulled out a worn notebook. "I started keeping records when I was 16. Every time I tried to get someone to investigate, every door that got slammed in my face, every piece of evidence that disappeared. I have 40 years of documentation showing how deep this corruption ran." Sarah Voss arrived halfway through lunch carrying her own set of folders. "I've been working with the state AG's office. They want to meet with both of you, all 3 of you. Your testimony is going to be crucial in the prosecution." "What about Tommy?" Frank asked. "Can they prosecute for what happened to him?" Sarah's expression was pained. "It's complicated. He wasn't physically harmed." "He was destroyed," Frank interrupted. "His life, his reputation, his livelihood. They killed him as surely as if they'd put a gun to his head." "I know, I agree. But proving that in court, proving direct causation, it's almost impossible. The best we can hope for is that the truth becomes part of the public record. That when people hear about the Millbrook toxic dumping scandal, they also hear about Tommy Martinez, the mechanic who tried to stop it." It wasn't enough. Eleanor could see that in her husband's face. It would never be enough. But it was something. Over the following months, the story unfolded in newspapers and court filings. Harold Whitmore pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact to murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. At 72 years old, it was likely a life sentence. Judge Patricia Hendricks also pleaded guilty to corruption charges. She served 3 years before being released on health grounds. The environmental cleanup became one of the largest in state history. 7 dump sites, decades of contamination, millions of dollars in remediation costs. The textile mill's former owners, the ones still alive, were forced to pay restitution. And Tommy Martinez became a local hero. His name attached to a new environmental protection bill the state legislature passed, requiring stricter oversight of industrial waste disposal. Eleanor and Frank were invited to the bill signing. They stood in the state capitol, surrounded by legislators and environmental activists and reporters, and watched the governor sign the Tommy Martinez Environmental Protection Act into law. Catherine Hendricks stood beside them, and when the signing was complete, she leaned over and whispered, "They're together now. Your brother and my father, finally free of it." Eleanor wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe in some cosmic justice where the wronged found peace and the guilty found punishment. But mostly, she believed in the small, concrete things. The photographs that had survived 40 years in a storage unit. The brother who'd kept the truth even when it cost him everything. The young lawyer who'd believed them. The reporter who'd made sure people were watching. The reception after the signing was held in a room with 2 bright lights and weak coffee. Eleanor found herself standing by the window, looking out at the Capitol grounds, when a young woman approached her. The reporter from the Gazette, Walt Emerson's protege. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Riley Chen. I've been covering the trial. I wondered if I could ask you some questions for a longer piece I'm writing about the case." "About the corruption?" Eleanor asked. "About your brother-in-law. About what it costs to do the right thing when everyone around you is doing the wrong thing." Eleanor studied the young woman's earnest face. "You're asking if it was worth it, if Tommy's sacrifice meant anything." "I'm asking what you think. You're the one who lived with the consequences." Eleanor thought about the 40 years of not knowing, the storage unit they'd almost let go, the debt they couldn't pay, the judge who tried to bury the truth one more time. "I think," she said slowly, "that the truth is like water. You can dam it up, redirect it, try to make it flow where you want, but eventually it finds a way through." Tommy built a dam that held for 40 years, holding the truth until the moment it needed to break free. Was it worth it? He lost everything. But because of him, hundreds of people won't get sick from contaminated water. Dozens of powerful people faced justice. The system that protected them got exposed. So yes, I think it was worth it. I just wish he'd lived to see it. Riley nodded, writing quickly. "One more question. The storage unit. Why do you think your brother never told anyone about it? Why hide the evidence instead of going public right away?" "Fear," Eleanor said simply. "He was terrified. He'd seen what they did to Robert Hendricks. He knew what they were capable of. But he also knew that if something happened to him, if they silenced him the way they'd silenced Hendricks, there had to be a record, somewhere, safe, somewhere the truth could survive even if he didn't. A failsafe. A last act of courage from a man who was too scared to be courageous while he was alive." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I understand that better now than I did when I was younger. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway, even if no one ever knows, even if it destroys you." The interview ran the following Sunday, a full-page spread with photographs, including one of young Tommy that Eleanor had provided from the family albums. The headline read, "The Mechanic Who Wouldn't Look Away: How Tommy Martinez's Hidden Evidence Brought Down a Decades-Old Corruption Ring." Frank read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table, tears running down his face. "People know now," he said. "They know he wasn't just a drunk. They know he was a hero." Eleanor sat beside him, her own eyes damp. He was always a hero. Now everyone else knows it too. The storage facility, Morrison's, went out of business 6 months after the trial. The publicity had been devastating. Who wanted to store their belongings at a place that had been used to hide evidence of murder and corruption? Denise, the manager, called Eleanor to let her know. "We're auctioning off the remaining units," she said, "but Unit 47, I wanted you to know, we're preserving it. The Historical Society is interested in turning it into a kind of memorial, a reminder of what happened, if that's okay with you and Frank." Eleanor had to think about it. The idea of Tommy's final act becoming a tourist attraction felt wrong somehow, exploitative. But then she thought about all the storage units, like 47, all over the world, holding secrets and shame and evidence and truth, waiting for someone to care enough to look inside. "Yes," she said, "do it, but make sure they tell the whole story, not just the corruption, all of it. The fear, the cost, what it takes to stand up when everyone else is sitting down." 1 year after the trial, on the anniversary of Tommy's death, the Historical Society held a dedication ceremony for the Tommy Martinez Memorial at Morrison Storage. Unit 47 had been preserved exactly as they'd found it, minus the evidence that was still being used in ongoing trials. The plastic tub, the duffel bag, the empty lockbox, all carefully displayed behind plexiglass, with placards explaining their significance. The ceremony was small. Eleanor and Frank, their children and grandchildren, Catherine Hendricks, Sarah Voss, Walt Emerson, and Riley Chen, a handful of local officials who wanted to be seen supporting accountability and transparency. The mayor spoke about the importance of whistleblowers and protecting those who spoke truth to power. It was a good speech, even if it rang a bit hollow coming from a politician. Frank said a few words about his brother, about childhood and loss, and the complicated mathematics of sacrifice. And then Eleanor, who hadn't planned to speak, found herself standing at the makeshift podium, looking at the faces gathered in the cold November air. "I never met the version of Tommy who took those photographs," she began. "I knew the version who was scared and drinking too much and pushing everyone away. I knew the man who died too young, worn down by secrets I didn't understand. But I'm getting to know the other Tommy now, the one who was braver than he felt, who documented crimes because someone had to, who made sure the truth survived even when he couldn't." She paused, looking at Unit 47, at that small metal box that had held such consequential secrets. We live in a world that asks us to look away. Every day, we see things that aren't right, things that should be questioned, things that should be stopped. And most of the time, we look away because it's safer, because it's easier, because we have families to protect and jobs to keep and lives to live. Tommy looked away too, for a while, but then he stopped. He decided that some things were more important than safety, and he paid for that decision with everything he had. Eleanor's voice cracked. Frank moved to stand beside her, his hand on her back. "I don't know what the right answer is," she continued. "I don't know if I would have made the same choice Tommy did. I don't know if I would have been that brave. But I know that I'm grateful he was. I'm grateful that, when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, my brother-in-law chose the truth, even though it cost him his life, his reputation, and 40 years of his family not understanding what he'd done." She looked at the small crowd. "So, when you leave here today, I hope you remember that. I hope you remember that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like ordinary people making impossible choices. Sometimes they look like mechanics with cameras, taking pictures they're terrified to take. Sometimes courage looks like a storage unit filled with secrets, waiting for the right moment to speak." The crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping. Catherine Hendricks, her lined face wet with tears. Others joined in. It wasn't the roar of a large crowd, but it was honest, and it was enough.
After the ceremony, as people dispersed to their cars, Eleanor and Frank stood alone in front of Unit 47. "Do you think he knows?" Frank asked. "Wherever he is, do you think he knows it mattered?" Eleanor thought about faith and justice and the strange path that had led from a storage facility notice to a courtroom revelation to this moment, standing in front of a memorial to a man who died believing had failed. "I think he knows," she said. "I think somehow he knows." That night, back in their small house, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She got up around 2 a.m. and made tea, standing in the kitchen in her robe, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, Frank's distant snoring, the hum of the refrigerator. On the counter was the copy of Tommy's letter they'd been given to keep. The original was still evidence. She picked it up and read it again for what must have been the 100th time. "If you're reading this, something's happened to me." Something had happened. 40 years of something, a slow destruction that had taken a good man and ground him down to nothing. But he'd won in the end. Not the way he'd probably imagined, not in time to save his own life or reputation. But he'd won. The truth had survived. Justice had come. Eleanor set down the letter and looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd sat the morning of the trial, terrified and uncertain. Nothing had really changed. They were still broke, still old, still facing the same struggles they'd faced before. But everything had changed too. They knew the truth now. They understood what Tommy had done and why.
They'd stood in a courtroom and watched powerful people fall because their brother-in-law had been brave enough to take pictures 40 years ago. The world was a strange place, Eleanor thought, full of locked boxes and hidden truths and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She finished her tea and went back to bed, sliding in beside Frank, who stirred and reached for her hand in his sleep. Tomorrow they would wake up to the same life, the same bills, the same aching joints and persistent worries. But they would also wake up to the knowledge that they were part of something larger, a story about justice delayed but not denied, about truth that refused to stay buried, about a mechanic who'd looked at something wrong and decided to do something right, consequences be damned. And in the end, Eleanor thought as sleep finally found her, maybe that was the only story that mattered, the one about people who chose, despite everything, to care. The photographs from Unit 47 became part of the permanent collection at the State Historical Society. The lockbox was displayed next to them, still bearing the rust of 40 years' neglect. School groups would tour the exhibit, learning about environmental justice and civic courage and the importance of documenting the truth. And occasionally, someone would ask the tour guide, did he know? Did Tommy Martinez know that his photographs would eventually bring down the people who destroyed him? The answer was always the same, no. He died believing he'd failed, but he made sure the evidence survived, just in case, and that was enough. The final chapter of the Millbrook toxic dumping scandal was written 8 years after the initial courtroom revelation. The last of the contaminated sites was finally cleaned up in 2032. Harold Whitmore died in prison in 2029, maintaining until the end that he'd only been following orders, protecting his family's interests, doing what was expected. Patricia Hendricks lived until 2035, dying at home after years of declining health. She never spoke publicly about the case. Catherine Hendricks wrote a book about her father and the decades-long fight for justice. It was published by a small press and never became a bestseller, but it was taught in environmental law classes and criminal justice programs. In the acknowledgments, she thanked Eleanor and Frank Martinez for refusing to let go of a storage unit everyone else wanted to forget. Frank Martinez died in 2027, at home with Eleanor beside him. His last words were about his brother. "We did right by him, didn't we?" "We did," Eleanor had promised. "He knows." Eleanor lived until 2034. She spent her final years telling Tommy's story to anyone who would listen. School groups, journalists, researchers studying corruption and whistleblowing. She kept a photograph of young Tommy on her mantle, the one where he was laughing, unburdened by the terrible knowledge that would come. When she died, her obituary mentioned the storage unit, the trial, the justice that had finally come. But what her grandchildren remembered most was the way she'd told the story, always ending with the same words. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave a record. Sometimes survival isn't about you. It's about the truth outlasting everything that tried to bury it. Unit 47 stood as a memorial for 15 years before the facility was finally demolished to make way for a new development. The Historical Society preserved the contents, but the physical space where Tommy Martinez had hidden his evidence was eventually destroyed. But the story lived on. In courtrooms where prosecutors cited the Martinez precedent for whistleblower protections. In environmental law textbooks that used the Millbrook case as an example of long-term contamination cover-ups. In journalism classes, where Riley Chen's original article was studied as an example of local reporting that changed everything. In families where grandparents told the story of the storage unit and the photographs and the mechanic who wouldn't look away, even when looking away would have saved his life. The truth, like water, had found its way through. It had taken 40 years, but it had found its way through. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Tommy Martinez finally knew that his photographs, his fear, his impossible courage, all of it had mattered. All of it had been worth it. The story of Unit 47 didn't end with justice or redemption or any of the clean endings we tell ourselves are possible. It ended the way most true stories do, with ordinary people making impossible choices, with consequences that rippled through decades, with truth surviving just long enough to matter. And with a lockbox, empty now, preserved behind glass, reminding everyone who saw it that sometimes the smallest acts of courage, taking photographs, renting a storage unit, refusing to look away, are the ones that change everything.